All right, the last reading of the night as the sun goes down very early, I might add. December 21st, this winter solstice, earliest sundown in the year. The shortest day of the year. We're right on top of it. It feels like I should be going to bed at 5:30 as early as the sun goes down. And it's Christmas time. And we're reading The Battle for Christmas. And this reading should be better than the last one because I'm not fighting my throat the way I was last time. So let's get into it. This will be page 99. This is from The Battle for Christmas. Pulitzer Prize finalist Stefan Nissenbaum is the author. A Cultural History of America's Most Cherished Holiday. If you want to go get the book, read it. That's what it looks like. And it's a really good book. Really good book. Hope you enjoy it if you buy it. Um, We're going to be at Bell Snickles and Burlesque Aquares in Philadelphia. I got to learn how to pronounce that because it's going to be in here. Burlesque Queers. Burlesque Queers. Okay. So anyway, let's get into it. History of Christmas in America. We're in the 1800s. Santa Claus came to Pennsylvania too. Now, we just talked about New York in the previous reading, so now we're in Pennsylvania. Santa Claus came to Pennsylvania too in the 1820s, but there he encountered a rival figure. Santa Claus has a rival, apparently, in the 1820s in Philadelphia, and somewhat scarier personage associated with the Germanic culture that pervaded much of the state. Let me get the light over here. There we go. That figure, whose features are already familiar to us, was commonly known as Belsnickel, B-E-L, or Baal, B-A-A-L. I wonder if it's associated with the sun god of the ancient world. I don't know. The term is a variant of the German phrase Pelsnickel, and this is where language can trick you. Um, so it may probably not, probably my assertion is wrong. Pelsnickel, that is Saint Nicholas and fur. So it has nothing to do with with Baal. But you can see where people make those kind of mistakes by associating things that shouldn't be associated. I do not know when or how the term was first used. It may not have come into usage until the 1820s, when Santa Claus himself was emerging. But it was almost certainly based on an older German figure, commonly known as Neck Repetsch. I don't speak German. Netsch Repatsch. You can imagine the kind of the angry German accent saying it. Netsch Repatsch. That is Rupert the servant. The British writer Samuel Taylor Coleridge encountered Netsch Ripperchart, whatever his name is, during a 1798 visit to Ritzburg, a village in the northern part of Germany. Netsch Ripprecht was a man outfitted in high buckskins, a white robe, a mask, and an enormous flax wig. In other words, he was burlesquing the dress of a gentleman. On Christmas night, this figure, in an accent, goes around to every house and says that Jesus Christ, his master, sent him thither. The parents and elder children receive him with great pomp of reverence, while the little ones are most terribly frightened. He then inquires for the children, and according to the character which he hears from the parent, he gives them the intended present as if they came out of heaven from Jesus Christ. Or, if they should have been bad children, he gives the parents a rod, and in the name of his master recommends them to use it frequently. In contrast to Santa Claus, who was never actually seen, the roles of both Netch Ripperch and the Belsnickel were performed by real people, generally men of lower orders. Why is it always the men of the lower orders? Generally men of the lower orders who went around town in disguise. The disguises varied, but they were always ornate and often involved in wearing a wig. But weren't the judges in England also wearing wigs? They're of the higher order. What, what Coleridge encountered resembles only the most carefully regulated form to this practice took in. Let me try it again. What Coleridge encountered resembles only the most carefully regulated form this practice took in Pennsylvania. Here, the Belsnickel would offer some small gifts, usually of food, to good children, and intimidate ill-behaved children by threatening to hit them, or actually doing so, with a rod or a whip as they reached for the gifts he had brought. A Philadelphia newspaper reported one such appearance in 1827, by which time the Belsnickel was already being compared to Santa Claus. It is interesting to note that this Belsnickel was made up in blackface. Oh, that would not go over well today at all. Not at all. All right, here we go. Mr. Belsnickel is a visible personage. He is the precursor of the jolly old elf Christkindl, or St. Nicholas, and makes his personal appearance dressed in skins or old clothes, his face black, a bell, a whip, and a pocket full of cakes or nuts. And either the cakes or the whip are bestowed upon those around as may seem meet to his sable majesty. In this form, the Belsnickel, although an intruder, would serve to reinforce the authority of the householders he visited. Indeed, at least one father assumed the role himself. But it is clear that Belsnickling, like most rituals, was profoundly malleable. The Belsnickel might snap his whip at a child who had behaved well, or a whole group of Belsnickels might visit a house together. Often the Belsnickel frightened the parents as well as the children. In fact, Belsnickels frequently struck those they visited as unsavory, perhaps because they were frequently played by men of the lower orders. James L. Morris, a shopkeeper from Morgantown, Pennsylvania, described them in his diary in 1831 as horrid, frightful looking objects. In 1842, Morris recorded his impressions at great length. Christmas Eve, a few Belsnickels or Christnickels were prowling about this evening, frightening the women and children with their uncouth appearance, made up of cast off garments, made uh, party colored with patches, a false face, a shaggy head of tow, or rather wig, falling profusely over the shoulders and finished out by the most patriarchal beard of whatsoever foreign material that could possibly be pressed into such service. Bell Snickles could wreak mischief, as they did in Pottstown, Pennsylvania in 1826, where for several nights running one or more of them left a wreck of lumber that is stewed through our streets and blockading the doors generally every morning. A complete bridge built across the street, principally composed of old barrels, hogsheads, grocery boxes, wheelbarrows, harrows, plows, wagon and cart wheels. It is reported that he nearly demolished a poor woman's house in one of the back streets a few nights ago. Despite the damage this Belsnickel did, the phrasing of this report suggests that he was seen as a mere prankster. He performs these tricks incog, or otherwise he would be arrested long since by the public authorities who are on the alert, but it will take a swift foot and a strong arm to apprehend him while he is in full power of his Belsnickelship, as he then can evade mortal ken. Like wassailers and murmurs, Belsnickles often took on the role of beggars visiting houses and shops to demand rather than offer gifts. This may very well have been the reason that 4 or 5 of them visited James L. Morris's store in 1842 and once again in 1844, when Morris noted that some 4 or 5 hideous and frightful looking mortals came into the store dressed out in fantastic rags and horrid faces. These Belsnickles were probably coming for gifts. In 1851, several processions of them in Norristown, arrayed in all their fantastic costumes, paid their annual visit to the shopkeepers and citizens, soliciting the good things and rendering an equivalent in caricaturing the sable sons of our soil. In other words, they too were performing in blackface. They were still begging in the 1870s. This was the case in Lancaster, for instance, where the old custom of playing Belsnickel was renewed in our midst. And we heard perhaps half a dozen parties dressed in hideous disguise, going about on Christmas Eve from house to house and entering without so much as by your leave, or in Carlisle, where in the same year there were numbers of Belsnickles going from house to house in quest of cakes, wine, apples, or whatever else the good housewife might place at their disposal. Large boys and small boys. In the latter instance, they were dressed in women's clothes, burlesquing the ruling fashions among the ladies. The examples above make it clear that youths and boys were playing the Belsnickel roll themselves. This reverting or reverting, I'm going to try it again. The examples above make it clear that youths and boys were playing the Belsnickel roll themselves, thus reverting to the original structure of the ritual. In reading, in 1851, juvenile harlequins were running from house to house, scattering nuts, confections, consternation, and amusement in their way. Or in Norristown, where in 1853, silly children paraded the streets dressed in hideous masks. Or in Easton in 1858, where the Belsnickels were a most attractive feature on the streets, as there seemed to be a general feeling among the juveniles to participate. But these youthful Belsnickels were frequently a source of annoyance rather than amusement, as in Pottstown, where the local newspaper was not amused in 1873. Pottstown was full of Belsnickels on Christmas Eve, young chaps with their faces blacked, with masks, and dressed in all kinds of outlandish styles. These fellows, with their ugly mugs, visited the hotels, stores, shops, in many instances private dwellings, and went through their monkeyish grimaces and annoyed people with their horrible attempts at singing, making themselves odious throughout the town generally. These this Belsnickel business, which is becoming more of a rough and rowdyish observance of the Christmas season each year, might as well be omitted together. A malleable ritual, as I have said, but there is a pattern behind it. Whether the part was played by a grown man or child, and whether he acted as the donor of gifts or as a beggar, the Belsnickel always used his costume and his banner as a means of intimidating those who visited, a way of taking on an air of mock authority over the rest of the community. Young people had traditionally been just another part of the lower orders, so that it was socially natural for them to step outside the constraints of their normal roles by imitating what other plebeians were doing. And it was a thin line, and probably more of a terminological distinction than a historical one, that divided the Belsnickel from a murmur, a Callithumpian from, or simply a hoodlum. On the other side of the cultural ledger, Belsnickels were frequently referred to as Christkindl or Kris Kringle, or even Santa Claus. The particular term may have been a matter of local or even personal preference, but whatever he was called then or termed now, the Belsnickel remained a lord of misrule. There seem to be virtually no records of Belsnickels in Pennsylvania in Philadelphia itself. But this too many I'm sorry, try it again. There seem to be virtually no records of Belsnickels in Philadelphia itself. But this too may be partly a matter of terminology. Since the city, in contrast to much of the Pennsylvania backcountry, was not dominated by German Americans, and in Philadelphia, as in New York, the distortion that was associated with figures of misrule took on a tone of greater menace. Susan G. Davis, who examined this aspect of Christmas in Philadelphia in an important 1984 article, observes that people arrested there for disorderly behavior at Christmas were uniformly young and male. And she attributes this to the breakdown of the apprenticeship system and the decline of craft skills. The general economic problem besetting youth and young men in a period of rapid industrialization. Rowdy Christmas revelry crystallized the city's year-round youth problem. Davis observes that in the street Christmas, rowdy youth culture reached its apotheosis. Concern over riotous holiday nights was constant from the 1830s on. The mid-1840s were especially uproarious, but tumult and commotion seemed ominous for decades. As early as 1833, the Philadelphia Daily Chronicle reported, throughout most the whole of Tuesday night, Christmas Eve, riot, noise, and uproar prevailed, uncontrolled and uninterrupted, in many of our central and most orderly streets. Gang of boys and young men howled and shouted as if possessed by the demon of disorder. Some of the watchmen occasionally sounded their rattles, but seemed only to add another ingredient to the horrible discord that murdered sleep. It is undoubtedly in the power of our city police to pervert slumbering citizens. I'm sorry. It is undoubtedly in the power of our city police to prevent slumbering citizens from being disturbed by the mad roars of such revelers. They weren't real happy with these folks, were they? The problem in Philadelphia, as well as New York, was that this kind of rowdiness had been transformed in an urban capitalist setting into something that respectable people found threatening, as they did in 1839 when a riot broke out on Chestnut Street, opposite the state capitol. The participants, one newspaper reported with disgust, could not have chosen a more public place. Throngs of persons were passing on both sides of the street, viewing all the sights that were to be seen. But a street fight was one of the entertainments that did not please a majority of them. Susan Davis reports that gangs of young men from the working class communities that surrounded Philadelphia were deliberately invading the downtown business and theater districts, where playgoers and promenaders thronged to view shop window illuminations. In Philadelphia, as in New York, respectable people placed the greatest measure of blame on alcohol. Drinking itself, as we have seen in chapters 1 and 2, had been an interclass ritual at Christmas, but now it was becoming a way of distinguishing the classes from one another. In 1839, a newspaper pointed out in a Christmas Day editorial that there are certain modes of rejecting which are appropriate to Christmas, and other modes of doing the same thing which are quite unbecoming and reprehensible. But the editorial went on to acknowledge that this was a recent development and even to analyze how it had come about. Here we go. Some years ago, every housekeeper thought it incumbent on himself or herself to provide a bowl of eggnog or spiced toddy for the celebration of this day. Parsons, who were usually of temperate or sedate habits, seemed to think that the return of Christmas justified a slight degree of intoxication. Friends and acquaintances who called to tender the compliments of the season were urged to partake of these liquor preparations, the seductive taste of which frequently overcame the most sober resolutions. On such occasions, it may be supposed that there were many evidences of joy and hilarity, but it was properly questioned by some considerate persons whether that kind of joy and hilarity became suited a day set apart to commemorate the origin of Christianity. When this subject was duly considered, the custom spoken of fell into disuse and soon became ranked among the barbarisms of a former age. We are happy, therefore, to find that one incorrect mode of celebrating Christmas is no longer general, though particular, in though particular instances may be noted wherein the relics of these absurd practices are still preserved. By the late 1840s, that attitude had come to be backed by force of law. Philadelphia simply banned the sale of alcohol. It became a dry community. By that time, the temperance movement had gained widespread support. But that did not stop people from buying drinks in the neighboring towns, where, following an old Christmas tradition, as usual, the proprietors of groggeries that filled the by streets on either side of the boundaries of the city treated their motley customers with eggnog. Let's try it again. But if geographic dividing lines were hard to draw, so were psychological ones. Even the newspapers themselves sometimes betrayed a lingering ambivalence toward rowdy behavior at Christmas. An 1844 editorial started out by describing the new domestic Christmas as religion in each man's house, a celebration of the spirit of the universe, humanized and domesticated. But the same editorial went on to acknowledge that today also had a long tradition of high rejoicing, eating, drinking, and getting drunk, we presume. Or take the headlines that one Philadelphia newspaper employed to report the arrest of men charged with inciting riot and similar forms of behavior. One such report from 1836 was headed Christmas Gombles. Others in subsequent years were headed Christmas Festivities in 1840, Fun on Christmas Day in 1841, Christmas Sprees in 1846, and Christmas Sport in 1850. These headings revel an accurate uncertainty about what to make of such behavior. The phrasing may be sarcastic, but it also betrays a residual understanding that rowdy behavior was to be expected at Christmas. In Philadelphia, the matter was made more complicated by another Christmas ritual, one that seems to have been unique to that city. In Philadelphia, during the late 1830s and 1840s, even respectable people observed Christmas Day in part as a public occasion. Each year, thousands of people would spend the afternoon promenading in the downtown streets, attracted in part by the sheer sociability of the proceedings and in part by the prospect of doing their Christmas shopping, an activity that many Philadelphians, in common with residents of other cities, engaged in on Christmas Day itself. Downtown shops generally remained open on both Christmas Eve and Christmas Day. The scene attracted notice nationally. Niles National Register reported that on Christmas Day, 1841, Chestnut Street, the main commercial street, was crowded with a dense mass of human beings. The entire population of the outer districts seemed gathered there, eagerly gazing at the sights in the shop windows and enjoying the excitement of the moving panorama. It is estimated that there were 40,000 people on Chestnut Street most of the afternoon. It is clear from such reports that the moving panorama itself was part of the show. People went to see and be seen, dressed in their best outfits, outfits presumably purchased in local establishments. This was the Philadelphia equivalent of New York's visiting in New York. Visiting in New York. This was the Philadelphia equivalent of New Year's visiting in New York. The Christmas Day promenades always bore an edge of menace, and by tracing local coverage after 1840 through a single newspaper, the Public Ledger, we can see that edge grows sharper year by year. In 1840, the promenade was described as an impressive scene. We never before saw Chestnut Street so thronged from morning to night in passing and repassing. Indeed, one to make any progress was obliged to take the center of the street. But the report added defensively, "This is right." The tone was still quite positive in 1841, even though the crowds on Chestnut Street were so dense that people were struggling and jostling their way through the mass of humanity that well nigh blocked the great thoroughfare of fashion. In 1842, from early afternoon until midnight, the whole city seemed to have emptied into Chestnut Street, which was filled with a dense mass of human beings, young and old, male and female, great and small, black and white. This report went on to describe the promenaders as a rude and noisy crowd. In 1843, after describing the promenade as an impressive display of fashion, the writer of the article acknowledged that a number of arrests were made for disorderly conduct and breaches of the peace, and no small number were taken up for being intoxicated. There were more drunken men and boys in our streets than we have witnessed for many a day before. And again, the 1844 article indicated that some portions of the crowd had chosen to dress in bizarre style, tricked out in burlesque garb, and that they were making cacophonous music. Cacophonous music with instruments from the trumpet to the penny whistle. A further report commended that an easy, carnival like, practical joking air pervaded the moving crowd, and noted ambiguously that many young men, individually and collectively, paraded the streets dressed in fantastic attire, ready for all kinds of sport. It is not clear what kinds of sport these young men were ready for, but the fact that they were young and male links them with the one demographic group that had long been most closely associated with Christmas misrule. In any case, the reporter went on to condemn all the drunkenness and to recommend that our temperance friends should increase their zeal to counteract this fresh attack by the enemy. It was a warfare for those guys. Oh, they did not like these young men. All right, here we go. The tide was turning. In 1841, I'm sorry, try it again. The tide was turning. In 1845, there was no coverage at all of the promenade. Only a brief notice that Christmas was duly celebrated on Thursday, followed by a very lengthy report headed Rowdyism. In 1846, there was, once again, only a very brief item, 4 sentences, noting that Christmas Day witnessed the usual festivals, and followed by another report of rowdy behavior. There was undoubtedly more drunkenness visible in the streets than has occurred for years before. Finally, in 1847, a severe snowstorm on Christmas Day forced most Philadelphians to give up the promenade and spend the day at home. The result was almost an epiphany for the writer of an editorial that appeared in the Public Ledger. It was as if he had discovered that Christmas could best be celebrated without leaving one's house after all. He suggested that the poor weather actually made for a merrier Christmas than we've had for several years. The ladies could not leave their houses, it is true, and we missed their pretty faces and winning smiles from Chestnut Street. But looks were brighter and smiles were sweeter where they are most valued, at home. It is no wonder, then, that the streets were comparatively deserted. For husbands, sons, brothers, and lovers deemed themselves the happiest within the family circle. It was true, this writer continued, that not everyone stayed at home. Some persisted in maintaining the old ways. I'm sorry, that was the other. I'm going to read that the normal way. It was true, this writer continued, that not everyone stayed at home. Some persisted in maintaining the old ways. Here goes back to the article. Those who were in the streets defied the uncomfortable weather with rude revelry, and occasionally the ear was attracted to their shouts as they circulated from one tavern to another, imbibing at each another quantity of vinous excitement. But such people were not partaking in the real spirit of Christmas. The only pleasures that qualified as true holiday mirth were those of home and hearth. We have said that the day was a merry one. It was so at home. Those who were out were merry also. I'm sorry, I'm trying again. Those who were out were merry also, but it was only the forced merriment that Bacchanalian libations bring. And we'll stop there on page 107. The next one is going to be creating children, and that might take us toward the end of the chapter here. Maybe not. It's a pretty long chapter. But we'll get a chunk of it. Chapter ends at 131. We're at 106, so that's not too bad. And chapter 4 is affection's gift toward a history of Christmas presents. So we'll learn about all that. So it's good to know the true history of Christmas in America because that's where I celebrate Christmas. I don't know where you celebrate it, but knowing the history of these things is important because it gives an insight as to the traditions, the rituals, why they're there, where they come from, why people celebrate them. That is a good thing to know. Anyway, thank you for watching. I appreciate it. I hope you enjoy these readings. I'm not the best in the world at it, but I try my best to make it as interesting as possible and try to have my voice as healthy as possible in these readings. But my goal is that these videos will be up long after I've gone and to be with the Lord in heaven and my grandchildren are my age, that these videos will still be available and people can come on here and listen to these readings, the Bible, the different religious books, history, and books like this that I'm reading. There's going to be a variety of books that I'm going to do on this channel. And as I do them, I'll get better and better at it. But I hope it's a blessing to you guys. And if you like it, please like and subscribe. And I'll see you next time here on the C Files.